I paid for a VIP ticket to an elite party from the dark web. The guests aren't planning to let me leave. I've made some bad decisions in my life, but this one takes the cake. And honestly, I should have seen it coming. If something sounds too good to be true, it usually is. But the allure of something mysterious, something exclusive, got the better of me. And now, I'm paying the price. It all started a few weeks ago. I had been scrolling through Reddit, bored out of my mind, when I stumbled across a thread about the dark web. You know the kind. People sharing their horror stories about stumbling upon hitmen for hire, bizarre cults, and twisted games. I've always had a morbid curiosity about that side of the internet, so I dug deeper. One comment in particular caught my eye. It was about these elite underground parties you could supposedly only access through the dark web. The post described them as the kind of events you only heard about in rumors, held in secret locations, invite only, filled with the richest, most influential people you've never heard of. The commenter claimed to have attended one of these parties, but then quickly deleted their post. That should have been my first red flag, but like an idiot, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The idea of sneaking into a world so hidden, so secret, was intoxicating. I wasn't some random teenager. I'd been around the web long enough to know how to access the darker corners of it, so I started looking. At first, it was dead ends, forums with no activity, vague messages from faceless accounts. But then, after days of digging, I found a link buried in the comments of an old post. It led me to a page, black background, white text, advertising a VIP experience to one of these elite gatherings. They called it the Masquerade. The page didn't say much, just that it was an invitation to a world of luxury, power, and no limits. But the part that really got me, it said you could buy your way in. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the way the page was written, like it was a challenge. Maybe it was the isolation I'd been feeling lately, the need to do something, anything that made me feel alive. Whatever it was, I clicked the button without thinking. The price for a ticket was steep, way more than I should have been willing to spend, but I convinced myself it was worth it. Once I sent the payment, I got an email, just an address and a date, nothing more, no instructions, no ticket to print out, just a cryptic message saying, "Your name will be on the list. Don't be late." The day of the party, I almost backed out. Something about it felt off, like I was playing with fire. But I'd already paid, and curiosity got the better of me. So, I put on my best suit, grabbed a mask I had left over from a Halloween party, and headed to the address. It was in the middle of nowhere. Seriously, the kind of place where GPS gives up and you're left staring at empty fields for miles. But as I got closer, I started seeing signs. Subtle things like luxury cars parked along the side of the road, soft lighting guiding the way. The address led me to this massive, old mansion, something straight out of a Gothic novel. People were arriving, all dressed to the nines, wearing elaborate masks. I'll admit, it was impressive. There was something about the anonymity, the grandeur, that made me feel like I'd stumbled into another world. I gave my name at the door, and to my surprise, they checked me off without a second glance. Inside, it was even more extravagant. Chandeliers dripping with crystals, marble floors, a string quartet playing in the corner. But it wasn't the decor that stood out. It was the people. Everyone was so poised, like they belonged there, like they'd been to 100 of these parties before. I tried to blend in, but I could feel eyes on me. Not everyone was wearing masks, and the ones who weren't had this intense, predatory look about them. I should have left then, but I didn't. The The party started out like any other high-class event. Drinks, conversation, more money in one room than I'd ever seen in my life. I overheard snippets of conversations that made my skin crawl. People talking about their power, their control over others, like it was some kind of game. And then, things got weird. Around midnight, the lights dimmed and the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't the casual, playful vibe from before. There was tension in the air, a kind of expectation. The music slowed and everyone gathered in the ballroom. The masks came off, and suddenly, I felt like the only person in the room who didn't belong. A man stepped forward, tall and impossibly elegant, his voice like silk as he addressed the crowd. "Welcome to the masquerade," he said, his eyes sweeping the room. "Tonight, we celebrate those who dare to be more." His gaze landed on me for a split second, and I felt my stomach drop. "This is the night where we cast aside the illusions of power," he continued, "and reveal who holds the true reins." The crowd responded with murmurs of approval, but I could sense the undercurrent of something darker. The man's eyes flicked to me again, and this time they didn't move on. "Let the games begin," he said. Before I could process what he meant, the doors to the ballroom slammed shut with a deafening bang, and every face in the room turned toward me. It wasn't an invitation. It was a trap. I don't think I'll ever forget that moment. The way the room shifted, how the air grew heavier, thicker, like the very walls were closing in. Every face in the ballroom was turned toward me, watching, waiting. It was like I'd become the centerpiece of their twisted little game, and I had no idea what the rules were. I felt my palms sweat, my heart thudding against my ribcage as I stood there frozen, unsure of what to do. There was no backing out now. The man, the one who had introduced the event, never took his eyes off me, his lips curling into this thin, knowing smile. I could tell he enjoyed this, the tension, the fear radiating off me. "You?" he said, his voice slicing through the silence like a blade. Step forward. Every instinct screamed at me to bolt, to run, but my legs wouldn't listen. Instead, I found myself moving, almost as if I was being pulled by some unseen force. The crowd parted as I approached the center of the ballroom, their eyes following me like predators watching prey. I could hear the faint whispers around me, low and hushed, but I couldn't make out the words. Whatever they were saying, it wasn't good. The man gestured to a raised platform at the front of the room, lit by a single spotlight. "Please, join us." I hesitated for a second, but then I caught a glimpse of the doors. They were still shut, bolted from the inside. No way out. Reluctantly, I stepped onto the platform, the sound of my shoes echoing in the stillness. The weight of 100 eyes bore down on me as the man stood beside me, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. His touch was cold, unnervingly so. "Tonight," he said, his voice smooth, almost hypnotic, "you've been chosen. You will represent all those who seek to understand the true nature of power." The crowd murmured in approval, though I could feel the tension rising. My throat was dry, and I wanted to ask what the hell was going on, but something stopped me. It was the way they looked at me, like I was already lost, like they knew something I didn't. The man stepped back, his gaze never wavering. "The rules are simple. Survive the night, and you will leave here with more than you ever imagined." I opened my mouth to protest, to ask what the hell that meant. But before I could get a word out, the room plunged into darkness. The chandeliers flickered, casting long shadows across the marble floor, and the once elegant partygoers now looked distorted, their faces twisted by the dim light. The whispers started again, louder this time, urgent. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was anticipation. They were waiting for something. And then, I heard it, a door creaking open behind me. I turned, squinting through the darkness, trying to see what was coming. My heart raced as the door at the far end of the room slowly swung open, revealing nothing but pitch black beyond it. No one moved. The silence was suffocating, each second stretching longer than the last. I could hear my own breath, ragged and shaky. Suddenly, the man spoke again, his voice low and dripping with malice. "The guests of honor have arrived." From the darkness beyond the door, I saw them. Shadows, at first. Just faint figures, moving slowly, deliberately, like they didn't belong in this world. My chest tightened as they came into view. The masks, they were wearing masks, but not like the ones the partygoers had on earlier. These were grotesque, animalistic. Faces of snarling beasts and twisted, unrecognizable creatures, distorted in ways that didn't seem human. But it wasn't just the mask. They were wrong. Their movements were unnatural, jerky, like their limbs were bending in ways they shouldn't. I took a step back, but it was like the air itself was heavy, pressing down on me, keeping me from running. The guests, the new ones, stalked forward, their eyes, or at least the spaces where their eyes should have been, locked on me. The room seemed to shrink around me, the air growing colder with each passing second. I could hear their breathing now, heavy and deliberate, like they were savoring every moment, drawing out the terror. I looked toward the other partygoers, hoping someone would step in, but they just watched, their faces expressionless, like this was all part of the show. The man beside me smiled, his teeth gleaming in the dim light. "They've come to play," he said softly, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Play? I didn't want to find out what he meant by that. My fight or flight instincts kicked in, and this time, flight won. I bolted. I didn't care about making a scene or about looking weak. I just needed to get out. I ran toward the door we had come in through, but it was locked, the heavy wooden door, refusing to budge. Panic set in as I yanked at the handle, desperate, my heart racing faster with every second. Behind me, I could hear the creatures, the guests, moving closer. Their footsteps were slow, almost methodical, like they knew there was no rush. I could feel the weight of their presence growing, a cold sweat forming on my skin. My hands fumbled with the door, but it was useless. It wasn't going to open. "Leaving so soon?" The man's voice echoed across the room, teasing, filled with amusement. I turned, my back pressed against the door, and watched in horror as the creatures, those twisted, masked things, closed in. Their masks glinted in the low light, eyes, if they even had them, never leaving me. I could feel their hunger, the sheer malevolence in the air, and it sent chills down my spine. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have time for one. All I knew was that I had to move. I ducked past one of the creatures as it reached out, its fingers long and unnaturally thin, and ran toward the only other door in the room. It was slightly ajar, like an invitation, but I didn't care. I'd take my chances with whatever was behind it. I shoved the door open and stumbled into the hallway beyond, slamming it shut behind me. The echo of the door closing rang out in the silence, and for a second, I thought I was safe. But then I heard it, scratching. Soft, persistent scratching from the other side of the door, like they were testing it, waiting for me to make my next move. The hallway was dimly lit, long and narrow, stretching out into darkness. I had no idea where it led, but I knew I couldn't stay where I was. I took off running again, the sound of my footsteps echoing as I went. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing, the air growing heavier with every step. There was no way out of this. I should never have bought that ticket. The hallway seemed endless, stretching into the shadows like a nightmare that refused to end. My legs burned with each step, but I couldn't stop. I didn't even dare to look back. The scratching from behind the door still echoed in my head, like nails on a chalkboard, and I was convinced I could hear those grotesque guests following, their heavy, unnatural footsteps dragging along the floor. I don't know how long I ran, but it felt like hours. The further I went, the more twisted the mansion became. The walls weren't straight anymore, curving unnaturally inward like they were closing in. I swore the wallpaper was shifting too, changing from elegant patterns to something that looked alive, pulsing faintly in the dim light. Every now and then, I'd hear whispers, low and unintelligible, like the house itself was watching me, talking about me, planning something. I was completely and utterly lost. The grandeur of the party was long gone. Now I was in the belly of something far darker, something that felt ancient and wrong. I turned a corner and found myself in front of a large, ornate door. It was different from the others I'd seen, almost out of place in this nightmare of a hallway. There was no lock, just a heavy brass handle, worn smooth from use. I hesitated, my hand hovering just above it. I didn't want to open it. I knew deep down that whatever was behind this door was worse than what was chasing me. But the sound of those dragging footsteps was getting closer, and I was out of options. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was massive, far larger than it should have been given the size of the mansion. At first glance, it almost looked like a ballroom, but everything about it was wrong. The walls were lined with old, cracked mirrors, and the ceiling stretched impossibly high, lost in shadows. In the center of the room was a long banquet table, covered in dark red cloth, and seated around it, dressed in tattered, outdated clothing, were figures, motionless, their heads bowed as if they were waiting for something or someone. I couldn't tell if they were alive. Their skin was pale, too pale, and they sat unnervingly still, their hands folded neatly in their laps. Their masks were cracked and decayed, barely holding together, and I could see glimpses of what lay beneath, rotting flesh, hollow eye sockets. My stomach churned, and I forced myself to look away. But the worst part? There was an empty chair at the head of the table, as if it had been reserved for me. The door slammed shut behind me with a loud bang, and I jumped, whipping around to see the handle twist and lock itself. I rushed back to it, yanking at the knob, but it didn't budge. I was trapped again, this time in a room full of them. My breath came out in short, panicked gasps as I backed away from the door. I had no idea what to do. The only exit was blocked, and there was no way I was going near that table. But as I moved toward the corner of the room, I felt it. Eyes on me. Slowly I turned, my heart hammering in my chest. One of the figures had lifted its head. I froze. My mind screamed at me to run, to do something, but my body wouldn't listen. The figure stared at me, its eyes, or what was left of them, hollow and black, like twin pits of nothingness. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just watched, and I could feel the weight of its gaze, cold and heavy. Then, one by one, the others at the table began to stir. Their movements were slow, deliberate, like they were waking up from a long sleep. They lifted their heads in unison, their hollow eyes fixed on me. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Their silence said everything. I wasn't supposed to be here. The figure at the head of the table, the one with the hollow eyes, slowly rose to its feet. Its limbs creaked, its joints stiff and unnatural, like it hadn't moved in years. It reached out a bony hand toward me, its fingers impossibly long, and pointed to the empty chair at the head of the table. An invitation. I shook my head, backing away, but the figure didn't lower its arm. The others around the table began to move, standing slowly, their rotten clothes hanging from their frail bodies. They were waiting for me to sit. I could feel my pulse racing in my throat, my breath coming out in short, panicked bursts. I had to do something. I had to get out of here. But the door was locked, and these things were closing in. Then, from behind me, I heard the door creak open again. A small, narrow crack of light poured in from the hallway. My heart leapt into my throat. An escape. Without thinking, I bolted toward the door. I could feel the figures moving faster now, their ragged breath filling the room as they scrambled to stop me. My fingers fumbled with the door handle, but I managed to pull it open just in time, slipping through and slamming it shut behind me. I didn't stop running. My legs carried me through the dark, winding hallways, my mind barely processing where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get as far away from that room as possible. My lungs burned, my muscles ached, but I couldn't stop. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled into another hallway. This one brighter, more familiar. The walls were lined with the same ornate mirrors, but they were clean now, polished. It was like I'd somehow looped back to the part of the mansion where the party had started. The only problem? The mirrors. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed something was off. My reflection, it wasn't moving the way it should have been. In the glass, my reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't copying my movements. It stood perfectly still, its eyes locked onto mine, a twisted smile forming on its face. I froze, my stomach turning. Slowly, my reflection raised its hand, but I hadn't moved. It pointed behind me. Dread filled my chest as I turned around. The figures from the ballroom were standing at the end of the hallway, their hollow eyes gleaming in the dim light. They were waiting for me to join them. I ran again. My legs felt like they were about to give out, but I didn't care. Every breath burned in my lungs, but the only thing keeping me going was pure fear. The hallways seemed to twist and stretch, endless and disorienting, but I couldn't stop. Those things were following me, always just far enough behind that I couldn't see them unless I looked over my shoulder. I'd made that mistake once. The mirrors on either side of me reflected it all, the pale, twisted figures stalking closer, and worse, my own reflection. It wasn't me anymore, not really. Every time I glanced at the glass, my reflection stood still, staring back at me with that same chilling smile, its eyes dark and empty. It pointed behind me, as if it wanted to remind me that I was being hunted, but I already knew. The air was thick with it, the sense of something closing in, something that wouldn't let me leave. I turned another corner, my footsteps echoing in the silence, and found myself in a new room. The hallway had opened up into a vast open space, a library, judging by the shelves lining the walls, crammed with dusty old books. The ceiling stretched high, disappearing into shadows, and a chandelier hung precariously from a chain that looked ready to snap at any moment. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a few flickering candles scattered across the floor, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, and I stumbled forward, barely catching myself on one of the shelves. My pulse pounded in my ears, and for a moment the room was deathly quiet. I stood still, listening, waiting for the inevitable sound of footsteps, for those figures to follow me inside. But nothing came. The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint crackling of the candles. I glanced around the room, my heart still racing, trying to figure out where I'd ended up. The place felt ancient, the kind of room that had seen things no one was supposed to see. The books on the shelves were old, their spines cracked and crumbling, the titles worn away by time. The smell of mildew clung to the air, mixed with something else, something metallic, like rust. Then I heard it, a faint sound, like the rustling of paper, coming from the far corner of the room. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned, my eyes scanning the dim space. There, in the shadows, I could just make out a figure hunched over one of the tables. At first I thought it was one of those things that had been following me, but this one was different. It wasn't wearing a mask, and its movements were slow, deliberate, like it wasn't aware of my presence yet. I took a step closer, trying to get a better look. The figure was dressed in tattered clothing, its back to me, and I could see its hands moving frantically over a piece of parchment, scribbling something I couldn't make out. There was something familiar about the way it moved, something that sent a chill down my spine. As I took another step, the figure froze. Its head jerked upward, but it didn't turn to face me. Instead, it let out a long, ragged breath, and I realized with a start that it wasn't alone. There was another figure standing beside it, hidden deeper in the shadows, watching me. I wanted to back away, to run, but my legs refused to move. The figure at the table slowly stood, its back still to me, and the sound of its breath grew louder, more labored. My pulse pounded in my ears, my throat dry. "I've been waiting for you," a voice whispered, low and rasping, coming from somewhere in the darkness. I swallowed hard, my skin crawling. The voice didn't belong to either of the figures. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, like the house itself was speaking to me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing about this made sense anymore. The figure at the table finally turned, and my stomach lurched. Its face, if you could even call it that, was a hollow void, a gaping absence where features should have been, just like the others. Its eyes were black pits, its mouth twisted into an unnatural grimace, as if it had been forced into that expression. The figure moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate, and I felt the temperature in the room drop. Behind it, the second figure stepped into the light, and my heart stopped. It was me. Or at least, it looked like me. An exact copy, down to the clothes I was wearing, but with one crucial difference: its smile. It wore the same twisted grin as my reflection in the mirrors, its eyes dark and empty. It took a step forward, mirroring my movements exactly, like a grotesque shadow. My mouth went dry as I watched it approach, the realization sinking in. It wasn't just a reflection, it was replacing me. "I've been waiting for you," the voice repeated. But this time, I realized it was coming from the doppelganger, the twisted version of myself that had been following me all along. The figures surrounded me now, closing in, their breaths raspy, labored. I backed away, my heart slamming against my chest. My mind raced for a way out, but I couldn't see one. Every door was sealed, every exit blocked. I was trapped, cornered by these things that looked like me, but weren't. The doppelganger reached out, its fingers brushing my arm, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. My limbs felt heavy, my vision blurring. It was like the life was being drained out of me, pulled into this twisted version of myself. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but my body was betraying me, growing weaker with each passing second. The rooms spun, the faces of the figures blurring into one, their hollow eyes piercing through the darkness. And then, as if on cue, the voice spoke one last time. "You've been chosen." Chosen for what? I didn't know, and I didn't want to find out. But as the darkness closed in around me, I realized something terrifying. There was no escaping this party. Not really. And soon, I wouldn't be me anymore. I don't know how long I was trapped in that cold, suffocating darkness. Time felt warped, stretched, and twisted like the halls of this nightmare mansion. My body had gone numb, but I could still feel the cold fingers of the doppelganger gripping my arm, draining me. Its face, my face, hovered in front of me, that hideous smile still plastered across it like a mask. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then, just when I thought I was slipping into oblivion, the grip loosened. The cold retreated, but only slightly, just enough for me to regain a fragment of control over my body. My mind raced, grasping for any chance to escape, but I felt so weak, like the energy had been sucked out of me. The figures, the twisted, rotting versions of the guests from earlier, were closing in. The doppelganger's eyes, dark and endless, bore into me, like it was waiting for something, waiting for me to break. I wasn't going to give it the satisfaction. Summoning the last bit of strength I had left, I yanked my arm free from its icy grip. The doppelganger's smile faltered just for a split second, and that was all I needed. I stumbled backward, my legs barely holding me up, and turned to run. My body felt like it was moving through molasses, each step agonizing, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I could hear the figures behind me, their raspy breaths growing louder, faster. The floor beneath me seemed to shift and crack as I ran, the walls warping and bending like the house itself was trying to keep me inside. But there, at the end of the long, distorted hallway, was a door. A single door, glowing faintly in the dark, like a beacon. I didn't know where it led, but I knew it was my only chance. I threw myself toward it, my heart pounding in my ears. The closer I got, the heavier the air became, thick with something unnatural. But the door remained open, a sliver of light spilling out from behind it. The figures were getting closer now, their twisted hands reaching for me, but I didn't look back. I slammed into the door, shoving it open with all the strength I had left, and stumbled through. The air on the other side hit me like a blast of cold wind, sharp and biting. I was outside. The night sky stretched above me, stars scattered across the darkness. But something was wrong. The mansion loomed behind me, larger than before, its windows glowing faintly with the flicker of candlelight. But there was no sound. The night was silent, too silent. No wind, no crickets, nothing. Just the sound of my ragged breathing. For a moment, I thought I'd made it. I thought I'd escaped. But then I heard it. That whisper. Soft at first, like a breeze through the trees. But it grew louder, sharper. It wasn't coming from the mansion anymore. It was inside my head. I turned, my heart sinking, as I realized what had happened. The doppelganger, the thing that had worn my face, was gone, but I could feel it. It was inside me. The figures hadn't needed to catch me. I'd brought it with me when I ran. The whisper grew louder, filling my mind with words I couldn't understand, but they carried a weight, a malice that made my skin crawl. My hands trembled as I backed away from the mansion, my body shaking with the effort. The light from the windows flickered and then slowly died, leaving me standing in the dark. I needed to leave. I needed to get as far away from this place as possible. My car was parked down the road, still waiting where I'd left it when I first arrived. It felt like a lifetime ago now. I stumbled toward it, the whispering in my head growing fainter, but never truly gone. It lingered like a presence just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. When I finally reached the car, I collapsed into the driver's seat, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. I started the engine, the familiar hum, offering a small sense of relief. But it was short-lived. As I pulled onto the empty road, the mansion disappearing behind me, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the rearview mirror. It was smiling. Not a normal smile. That smile. The twisted, unnatural grin that I'd seen on the doppelganger. My breath caught in my throat, and I swerved, nearly driving off the road. I blinked, trying to clear my head, but when I looked again, my reflection was normal. My own face, staring back at me, pale and exhausted. But I knew the mansion hadn't let me go. Not really. It had followed me, clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. The party wasn't over. It would never be over. The whispering came back, louder this time, echoing in my mind. You've been chosen. And as I drove down that empty road, away from the mansion, away from the nightmare I thought I'd escaped, I realized something terrifying. I would never leave. Not really. Not. I found my address on a dark web hit list. Someone wants me gone, and I don't know why. It all started on a regular Tuesday evening. I'm not someone who messes around with the dark web regularly. Let me make that clear up front. But like a lot of people, I have this morbid curiosity about what's really out there beyond the mainstream internet. We've all heard the stories, stuff that makes you question what's real and what's urban legend. But me, I never expected to become part of one. So, this friend of mine, Jake, who's way more into the deep web than I am, had been talking about it for weeks. He's that guy who's always digging into shady corners of the internet just for kicks. Last weekend, we were hanging out, and he mentioned this forum, some hidden site where people post hit lists. At first, I didn't believe him. It sounded like something out of a cheap thriller movie. But Jake? He said he could show me. I should have known better than to take him up on it, but I figured, what's the harm? Just a quick look, maybe a laugh, and then back to normal life, right? Wrong. Jake pulled out his laptop, fired up a VPN, and navigated through layers of weird links and pages. Finally, he landed on the forum he'd been talking about. The website looked basic, almost like it was from the 90s, just a black background with white text and a few sketchy-looking usernames posting in threads. The moment he scrolled down, I got this weird, sinking feeling in my gut. There it was, plain as day. Hit requests. Jake started reading out some of the entries, chuckling like it was all just some sick joke. But then he stopped laughing. His face went pale, and I'll never forget the way he turned to me, wide-eyed. Dude, this isn't funny anymore. I leaned over to see what he was staring at, and my blood ran cold. My name, my full name, was listed right there among the hit requests. Not just that, but my address. It wasn't just a vague mention. Whoever posted it knew everything. Where I lived, my work schedule, even the exact route I took for my morning runs. I couldn't speak. My throat went dry. It was like seeing your worst nightmare laid out in front of you, except this wasn't a dream I could wake up from. I backed away from the screen, and Jake slammed the laptop shut, like that would somehow erase what we just saw. But it was too late. That list, it was real, and someone out there had me in their crosshairs. The first wave of panic hit. I mean, why me? I'm just some average guy living a quiet life. I've never done anything to anyone that would warrant being on a hit list. I didn't even know what to do next. Call the cops? Tell my family? Or worse, what if it was a prank? Some twisted joke by a hacker? But deep down, I knew. This felt too real, too targeted. And the worst part? The post was recent. Posted 2 days ago recent. Someone was actively planning this. Jake was already on his phone, pacing around the room, trying to figure out who to call. Man, we need to report this. Maybe it's just a scam or something, he muttered, though the fear in his voice said he didn't really believe that. I wish I could say I handled it better, that I had some grand plan to deal with it. But I was frozen, mind racing 1,000 miles a minute. I felt exposed, like someone was already watching me from a distance. Every window, every creak in the house suddenly felt like a threat. After a few moments, I grabbed Jake's phone and forced myself to think straight. "Let's get out of here," I said. "Go somewhere public, where we can think." So we did. We left, practically running to Jake's car. But as we pulled out of the driveway, my stomach dropped again. Because right there, parked down the street, was a car I hadn't seen before. A black sedan, its windows tinted, and it was just sitting there, watching. We didn't talk much on the drive. I think both of us were too freaked out to even process what had just happened. Jake kept glancing in the rearview mirror like he was expecting that black sedan to follow us, but it didn't. At least, not yet. We ended up at this 24-hour diner a few miles from my place. It wasn't exactly busy, just a few other people scattered around the booths, most of them absorbed in their phones. The fluorescent lights inside felt way too harsh for the situation. I wanted to be somewhere dim, hidden, but anywhere was better than my house right then. We slid into a booth at the back, and I could feel the eyes of the waitress on us, probably wondering why we looked like we'd seen a ghost. Jake was jittery, tapping his fingers on the table like he couldn't sit still. I was trying to act calm, but my mind was still racing. My name, my address, my routine. Whoever had posted that hit request knew things about me that they shouldn't. Things no one should. "What if this is a scam?" Jake said, breaking the silence, but his voice didn't sound convincing. Like some troll on the dark web trying to freak people out. You know, messing with us. Then why was my name there? I shot back. How did they know all that stuff about me? Jake didn't have an answer for that. Neither did I. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized something even worse. This wasn't just random. Whoever put my name on that list had to have been watching me for a while. They knew exactly when I left for work, the precise path I took for my morning jogs. This wasn't some random stranger on the internet. This was someone close enough to track my movements. That's when my phone buzzed. I nearly jumped out of my seat. Jake stared at me, his eyes wide. Slowly, I pulled my phone out of my pocket and glanced at the screen. No number, just a message notification. "You can't hide forever." I stared at those words like they were burning a hole through the screen. My heart pounded in my chest so hard I thought it might burst. My hands shook as I showed the message to Jake. His face went pale again. "This isn't a prank," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. Jake's hand was already on his phone, typing furiously. "We need to call the cops," he muttered, but I stopped him. "And tell them what?" "That I found my name on some deep web hit list, and now I'm getting anonymous texts. They'll laugh us out of the station." I knew the police wouldn't take this seriously. Maybe I'd get a report filed, maybe even a patrol car sent around my neighborhood for a day or two. But after that, I'd be on my own. I'd seen enough true crime documentaries to know that by the time something like this gets real attention, it's often too late. We sat there for a few minutes, neither of us knowing what to do next. Every time someone came in or out of the diner, I flinched, expecting to see that black sedan again, or someone walking up to me with a gun. It felt like I was waiting for something horrible to happen, just sitting there helpless. Jake eventually spoke up. "Look, man, maybe we just lay low for a while. You can crash at my place, and we'll figure this out in the morning. Whoever's doing this can't keep an eye on you forever, right? I nodded, but I wasn't so sure. Still, I didn't want to go back to my house. Not after what we saw. Not knowing if someone was already waiting for me there. So we paid the bill, left a decent tip, and headed out. As we walked back to Jake's car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The diner parking lot was empty, except for a couple of old, beat-up cars that had probably been there all night. But I had this prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I turned my head, glancing around the lot, trying not to be too obvious, and that's when I saw it. Across the street, barely visible under the dim glow of a streetlight, was the same black sedan. I froze. Jake noticed me stop and follow my gaze. He saw it too. "Shit," he muttered under his breath. The car wasn't moving, but it didn't need to. Just seeing it there, parked at a distance, was enough to send my heart racing again. Someone was definitely following me. They knew where I was, where I'd gone. And they weren't in a rush. They were playing with me, waiting for something. "Get in the car," Jake whispered, though his voice was tight with fear. We both scrambled into his car and locked the doors. He started the engine, but I could see his hands shaking on the steering wheel. The black sedan didn't move. It just sat there, like it was mocking us, daring us to make the next move. Jake floored the gas, and we sped out of the parking lot, tearing down the road faster than we should have. The whole way back to his place, we kept checking the mirrors, waiting to see if the sedan was tailing us. But it never did. It was like it didn't need to. Whoever was behind this already knew where I was going. By the time we made it back to Jake's place, it was past midnight. His apartment wasn't anything special, just a small one-bedroom on the second floor of a rundown building on the edge of town. But right then, it felt like a fortress. At least we weren't alone on some empty street, and the thought of being surrounded by other people, even strangers, was weirdly comforting. Jake parked in his usual spot, but before we got out of the car, he cut the engine and just sat there for a second, gripping the steering wheel like he didn't want to let go. Neither of us spoke. The silence felt heavy, like we were both waiting for something to happen. Eventually, Jake broke the silence. "Do you think they followed us here?" "I don't know," I said, though my gut told me we hadn't seen the last of that black sedan. Whoever was behind this wasn't done, not by a long shot. We got out of the car, both of us scanning the parking lot and nearby streets. Nothing seemed out of place. No strange cars, no shadows moving in the dark. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us, lurking just out of sight. Jake's building wasn't exactly high security. The front door didn't even have a working lock. We slipped inside and made our way up the creaky stairs to his apartment. Once we were inside, Jake immediately bolted the door and slid the chain lock across. It didn't make me feel any safer. His place was a mess. Clothes piled up on the floor, empty pizza boxes on the coffee table, a gaming setup that took up most of the living room. But none of that mattered. All I cared about was getting out of sight, away from windows, away from whoever was out there. Jake tossed me a blanket and a pillow, gesturing to the couch. "You can crash here tonight, man. We'll figure this out in the morning." I nodded, but I wasn't planning on sleeping. My nerves were shot, my mind racing with a million questions and no answers. How long had they been watching me? Who were they? And why me? None of it made sense. Jake tried to stay up with me, but after an hour or so, he crashed hard, snoring softly in his room. I sat on the couch, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of traffic outside, the occasional footsteps from the apartment above. Every little sound felt amplified, like it could be a signal that something was about to happen. That's when I heard it, a faint, scraping sound. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then it came again, this time, closer. I held my breath, straining to listen. It was coming from the hallway. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving towards the apartment. My heart started pounding in my chest. I glanced at the door. The locks were still in place, but suddenly they didn't seem like enough. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I could see the faint shadow of movement underneath the doorframe. Someone standing there, just waiting. I didn't know what to do. My phone was in my hand, but I was too scared to move, too scared to even make a sound. I just sat there, frozen, praying that whoever or whatever was on the other side would go away. Then came the knock. It wasn't a normal knock. It was slow, deliberate. One knock, a pause, then another. It wasn't loud, but it echoed in the silence of the apartment like a thunderclap. I stared at the door, my heart hammering in my ears. My mind screamed at me to get up, to wake Jake, to call the police, but I couldn't move. Another knock. I held my breath, willing it to stop. Maybe if I didn't make a sound, they'd think no one was home and leave. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. Whoever was knocking knew I was inside. They had been watching me, tracking me. The knocking stopped, and for a brief second, I thought maybe they'd gone. But then, the doorknob rattled. It was soft at first, like someone testing it. But then it became more insistent. I could hear the metal clicking as the person outside twisted the handle, trying to force it open. I was on my feet before I knew what I was doing, backing away from the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The chain lock rattled slightly with the pressure, but the door held firm, for now. I stumbled back into Jake's room, shaking him awake. "Jake, someone's at the door." He sat up, groggy and confused. "What? Are you sure? Dude, maybe it's just the neighbor or..." But the rattling at the door grew louder, more frantic. Whoever was out there wasn't planning on waiting any longer. Jake bolted out of bed, his eyes wide with fear. As he grabbed a baseball bat from the corner of the room, we stood in the hallway, both of us staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. My phone was clutched in my hand, ready to dial 911, but I didn't want to make any noise. And then, silence. The rattling stopped. The footsteps retreated down the hallway. We listened as they faded away until there was nothing but the hum of the building again. Jake and I exchanged a look. Neither of us said a word, but I could tell we were both thinking the same thing. Whoever that was, they weren't gone. They were just biding their time. For the rest of the night, we stayed awake, sitting on the couch with the bat and my phone clutched tight, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, the sun started to rise, casting a faint glow through the blinds, and the terror of the night began to feel almost surreal, like maybe it was all in our heads. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't over. The daylight didn't bring much comfort. It was that cold, pale light that felt like it barely cut through the heaviness in the air. Jake and I hadn't slept at all. We just sat there, twitching at every small noise, barely speaking, afraid that whoever had been at the door would come back. And even though nothing happened for the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was far from over. When morning fully hit, Jake finally broke the silence. "We can't just sit here and wait for something to happen." He was right, but the question was, what do we do? Go to the police? What could we even tell them? That someone had knocked on the door and rattled the handle? That I found my name on a hit list on the dark web? There wasn't enough for them to act on, and I wasn't in the mood for skeptical cops dismissing me as paranoid. I stood up, pacing the room. We need to figure out who's doing this. If I'm on that list, there has to be a way to track who put it there. Jake scratched his head, thinking, maybe. I mean, I know some forums have user IPs hidden, but not all of them. Some can be traced. It's risky though. Digging deeper into the dark web, you could draw even more attention. I didn't like the idea, but what choice did I have? We were already deep in this, and the more time that passed, the more I felt like I was a sitting target. I agreed. Jake booted up his laptop again, this time with an air of caution that wasn't there before. His fingers moved across the keys, setting up all kinds of security measures, firewalls, and VPNs before diving back into the dark web. I hovered over his shoulder, watching as he retraced the steps we took last night, eventually landing back on that eerie hit list forum. The post with my name was still there, unchanged. The thread had only gotten longer. More requests, more victims. My stomach churned as I saw new names, addresses, and personal details appear as casually as if people were ordering pizza. But none of that mattered right now. We had one goal: find out who posted my name. Jake clicked on the username of the person who made the post. It didn't look like much, just a blank profile with a weird string of numbers and letters. No posts, no personal info. It seemed like a dead end. But then Jake's face lit up. Wait, I think I've got something. He pulled up another tab, running the profile through some sort of tool I didn't fully understand. I leaned in closer, trying to make sense of the code flashing on the screen. There's a chance this profile is connected to other activity, he muttered, mostly to himself. If this person used the same username or IP on different sites, we might be able to trace it. I didn't know what Jake was doing, but I watched as he hopped from one shady forum to another, chasing breadcrumbs. And then he paused, his face going pale again, like it had the night before. Dude, you're gonna want to see this. I leaned in, my eyes scanning the screen, and my blood ran cold. The profile that had posted my name, it had been active on another forum, a much smaller, more private one. This wasn't a place where hit requests were made. No, this was worse. It was a forum where people shared live streams, but not just any live streams. These were real-time surveillance feeds of people in their homes. Hidden cameras, some hacked, some planted, showing private, intimate moments of people who had no idea they were being watched. And one of the most popular threads? It was titled with my address. My heart stopped. I clicked on it before Jake could react, and what loaded next made my stomach lurch. It was a live feed of my house. The angle was from inside my living room, somewhere up near the ceiling, like a security camera. But I didn't have security cameras in my house. How the hell did they get this? I whispered, staring at the screen in horror. Jake's hands were shaking as he clicked through more posts. The timestamps were recent. The feed had been active for weeks. Every time I'd been in that room, someone had been watching. There were comments too. Sick, twisted remarks from people talking about what I was doing, what I was wearing, how close they thought the hit might be. I backed away from the laptop, feeling nauseous. This wasn't just some random threat anymore. They'd been watching me, waiting for the right moment. The thought that I'd been living under their gaze, without even knowing, made my skin crawl. Jake was already trying to shut down the connection, his voice frantic. We need to cut this off, right now. We can't let them keep watching. But before he could finish, my phone buzzed again. Another message. You're not safe anywhere. You think he can help you? My heart dropped. It wasn't just me they were targeting anymore. They knew I was with Jake. They were watching us, right now. I looked around Jake's apartment, my paranoia spiking. Were there cameras here too? Were we being recorded, even as we spoke? I grabbed Jake's arm. We need to get out of here, now. We didn't waste time. We shut the laptop, grabbed whatever we could carry, and bolted out of the apartment, barely stopping to lock the door behind us. As we ran down the stairs, my head was spinning. If they had access to my home, how far had this gone? How many other places had they infiltrated? When we reached Jake's car, I turned to him, breathless. We can't stay anywhere they know about. We need to go off the grid, somewhere they can't find us. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whoever was behind this could find me anywhere. We didn't have a plan. We just drove. The roads stretched out before us in a blur, streetlights flickering past as if the world was moving too fast to comprehend. Jake was gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white, and I was checking my phone obsessively, waiting for the next message. Every vibration made my heart stop, but there was nothing. Just silence. The quiet felt wrong, like the calm before something terrible. We need to figure this out, Jake said finally, his voice strained. We can't just keep running. They're going to find you no matter where we go. I knew he was right. If they had already planted cameras in my house, if they were watching me online in real time, then there was no telling how deep this went. It wasn't just a random person anymore. It felt like a machine. Something bigger. And it was closing in. We need to disappear, I muttered, thinking out loud. No phones, no credit cards, nothing that can be tracked. Maybe if we go far enough off the grid, they'll still find us, Jake interrupted, shaking his head. We're not dealing with just some hacker. This is organized. Whoever's behind this has resources. You saw that forum. These people, they've been watching you for weeks. They're not going to just stop because we vanished for a night. He was right again. The weight of it all was crushing, suffocating. I felt like a cornered animal. No escape in sight, no safe place to go. And then my phone buzzed. I hesitated, staring down at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. Jake glanced over, eyes wide, but I didn't need to say anything. He knew. The message was simple. Stop running. It's too late. There was no number attached, no way to trace it, just those 4 words, hanging in the air like a death sentence. What do we do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I hated how weak I sounded, but I was past the point of trying to hide my fear. Jake didn't answer right away. He just stared ahead, eyes locked on the empty road. And then he did something that surprised me. He turned the car around. What are you doing? I asked, panic rising in my chest. We can't go back to your place, We're not going back to my place, Jake said, cutting me off. His voice was steady, but I could see the fear in his eyes. We're going back to yours. I froze. What? Why? Because this isn't going to end until we face it. Whoever they are, whatever they want, they've been pulling the strings from the shadows. We need to confront them, force them out. I stared at him like he was insane. You want us to go back to my house? The place where they've been watching me? Where they probably have more cameras, more ways to track us? Jake's jaw clenched. It's the only way we're going to get answers. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was crazy, but a part of me knew he was right. Running wasn't going to solve anything. These people, or whatever they were, weren't going to stop just because I went off the grid. They would find me eventually. The only way out was to confront the nightmare head on. The drive back to my house felt longer than it should have. Every minute felt like a countdown to something I wasn't ready to face. By the time we pulled into my street, my heart was racing. and sweat was gathering at the back of my neck. It was quiet. Too quiet. No black sedan in sight. No obvious sign that anyone had been there since we left the night before, but I knew better than to trust that silence. The house stood there, dark and empty, but I could feel eyes on me, watching. We parked down the street, trying not to draw attention. Jake killed the engine, and we both sat there for a moment, staring at the house, gathering the courage to get out of the car. "You ready?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I was. But what choice did I have? We stepped out of the car, moving quickly and quietly across the street, staying low as we approached the front door. Jake had the baseball bat from the night before, gripping it like it was the only thing standing between us and whatever was waiting inside. I pulled my keys from my pocket, my hand shaking so hard it took me a couple of tries to unlock the door. As the door creaked open, a wave of stale air hit me, the smell of dust, and something else I couldn't place. The house felt different. It didn't feel like my home anymore. It felt like a trap. We stepped inside, the darkness swallowing us up. I flicked on the light, but nothing happened. The power was out. Great. "Let's check the living room," Jake whispered, motioning for me to follow him. "If they've been watching, that's where we'll find the cameras." I followed him, every step feeling heavier than the last. My eyes darted around the room, half expecting someone to jump out from the shadows. But the living room was empty, no sign of movement, no sign of life. Jake scanned the walls, the ceiling, looking for anything out of place. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he pointed to the corner of the ceiling, just above the bookshelf. There. A tiny, barely noticeable lens. A camera. "They've been watching you from here," Jake muttered, his voice tight with anger. "But there's no way this is the only one." We spent the next few minutes combing through the house, finding 3 more cameras, all hidden in places I never would have thought to look. The kitchen, the hallway, even my bedroom. My skin crawled as I realized how long they'd been watching every aspect of my life. Then my phone buzzed again. I pulled it out, my hands shaking. The message was short, chilling. "Look behind you." My blood ran cold. I slowly turned, my heart pounding in my chest. And there, standing in the darkened hallway, was a figure. Tall, motionless, watching. Jake didn't have time to react before the figure lunged forward. I barely caught a glimpse of a mask, a featureless, pale mask, before it all went black. I woke up in the hospital a day later, head throbbing, with no memory of how I got there. Jake was in the next room, bruised but alive. The police told me they found us both unconscious in my house. No sign of forced entry, no sign of the masked figure. And the cameras? Gone. Every single one of them. The messages stopped. The car never showed up again. But I know it's not over. I know they're still watching. Somewhere. I bought a smart home system from the dark web. It's recording conversations I don't remember having. So, I've always been into tech. Not like coding or building my own stuff. Nothing like that. I'm just the kind of person who always has to have the newest gadget. I've got smart speakers, smart lights, even a smart coffee maker that brews my cup before I get out of bed. It's probably a bit much, but I love convenience. Anyway, a couple of months ago, I started hearing about these smart home systems that go way beyond what your usual Google Home or Alexa can do. I'm talking about full automation, learning your habits, adjusting things without you even asking. It sounded like the future I'd been waiting for. But here's the thing. These systems aren't available in stores. They're not exactly legal either. I'm not proud of it, but I've dipped into the dark web a few times before. Nothing crazy, just for curiosity, really. One night, after a few beers, I found myself scrolling through a shady forum. That's where I saw the ad. AI-driven smart home system, customizable, fully automated, deep learning, AI limited stock. It was everything I'd been looking for, and at a price that seemed too good to be true. That should have been my first red flag. But you know how it is when you convince yourself something's legit because you want it to be. I placed the order, paid in crypto, and waited. A week later, a plain brown box arrived at my doorstep. No branding, no manual, nothing to explain what I'd just bought. Just a black hub, like a small router, and a few tiny sensors that I figured were supposed to go around the house. There was a flash drive too, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Setting it up was surprisingly easy. The system integrated with my existing smart devices without a hitch. The first few days, it worked like a dream. It dimmed the lights when I started winding down for bed, adjusted the temperature to my preferred setting without me saying a word, even turned on my favorite music when I walked through the front door. It was like having a personal assistant who knew me better than I knew myself. But then, things got weird. The first odd thing I noticed was the way it started making suggestions. Not like my Alexa asking me if I wanted to reorder toothpaste. This thing would predict stuff, like it knew what I was going to do before I did. I'd go to grab my phone to text a friend, and my phone would already be lit up with the messaging app open. I'd start thinking about ordering dinner, and my food app would pop up with my favorite meal already in the cart. At first I thought it was cool, but then it started to feel invasive. I started thinking maybe it was just reading my browsing history or tracking my habits. Creepy, but not that weird, right? That's what I told myself anyway. But last week, I found something that's been messing with my head ever since. It was late, like 2 a.m., and I couldn't sleep. So I decided to check the system's logs, just out of curiosity. I'm not a paranoid person, but I figured if it's learning my habits, maybe I could tweak the settings a bit, stop it from being too nosy. That's when I found the recordings. They were buried deep in the logs, hidden in a folder with no name. At first, I thought maybe it had been recording my voice commands, like how Alexa does when you ask her to play music or check the weather. But when I played the first file, I realized something was very, very wrong. The recording was of me, but it wasn't me. I mean, it was my voice, my apartment. Everything sounded normal. Except, I don't remember having this conversation. In the clip, I'm talking to someone, but there's no other voice on the recording. It's just me, having a one-sided conversation, as if I'm answering questions I can't hear. Yeah, I'll be home around 6, I say. No, I haven't talked to her yet. I'm still figuring it out. There's a pause, like I'm listening to a response. Then I laugh, a nervous, uncomfortable laugh. I don't know. I guess I could, but it seems risky. What if they find out? I don't remember saying any of this. I don't even know who I'm talking about. But the worst part? The timestamp. The recording was from 2 nights ago at 3:17 a.m. I was asleep, or at least I thought I was. I played the next file. Same thing. Me, talking in the middle of the night, responding to questions I couldn't hear. This time, I sounded angry. I told you I'm done with that. My voice snapped. I don't care anymore. Stop asking me. Another long pause. No, I said, quieter now. No, you're right. I don't want anyone else getting hurt. That's where the recording cuts off. I've checked the rest of the files, and they're all the same. Me, having conversations I don't remember, each one more unsettling than the last. There's no other voice, no clues about who or what I'm talking to, but the conversations, they feel personal, like whoever or whatever it is knows me. I've tried deleting the files, but they keep coming back. Every night, more recordings. Every time I listen, the conversations get darker, more cryptic. Now, I'm starting to wonder if it's not just recording me. What if this thing is making me talk? And if so, what am I agreeing to? The next few days after finding those recordings were a blur. I tried to brush it off at first, telling myself it was just some weird sleepwalking thing. I mean, people sleep talk, right? But I'd never done anything like that before. Still, I didn't want to admit to myself that something was seriously wrong. I avoided listening to any more recordings for a while, pretending everything was normal. But everything wasn't normal. It started with small things. My phone would be somewhere I hadn't left it, like sitting on the kitchen counter when I knew I'd left it by my bed. The thermostat would be cranked up, even though I hadn't touched it. And then there was my door, locked 1 minute, wide open the next. At first, I thought maybe I was being careless, distracted. It's easy to explain stuff like that away when you're freaked out and trying not to overreact. But then came the messages. One night, I'm watching TV, trying to unwind. My phone buzzes on the couch next to me, and I glance over at the screen. It's a notification from my smart home app, the one that controls the system I bought. I hadn't touched it in days, so it surprised me. The message was short. Do you want to let them in? My heart skipped. Let who in? I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the screen. Part of me wanted to delete the app right then and there, but another part, maybe the part that was still trying to convince myself this was all just a glitch, tapped on the notification instead. It brought up a live feed of my front door camera. There was nothing there. Just the empty front yard, a couple of cars parked on the street, the faint glow of streetlights in the distance. No movement, no sign of anyone. But the longer I stared at the screen, the more I felt like something was off. The street looked different, too quiet, too still. Almost like the video wasn't live at all, but a frozen image pretending to be live footage. Before I could think too hard about it, the app closed itself, just blinked out of existence. When I reopened it, the camera feed was gone. Not just the live feed, but the entire front door camera option, like it had never been installed in the first place. I sat there for a long time, staring at my phone, my brain scrambling for an explanation. None of this made sense. I tried to convince myself it was some sort of tech glitch, a bug in the system. Maybe the software was just malfunctioning. But deep down, I knew this was more than that. And then, the dream started. The first night, I didn't think much of it. I was already so on edge that it didn't surprise me when I had trouble sleeping. But the dream was off. It was the same every night. I'm sitting in my living room, but the lights are dim, and there's a strange pressure in the air, like I'm not alone. I can't see anyone, but I know someone's there, watching me from just beyond the edge of my vision. In the dream, I always get up and start walking around my house, but the layout is wrong. Rooms that don't exist are suddenly there, twisting corridors that don't belong. Doors that should lead outside just open into more darkness. I keep walking, feeling like I need to find something, someone, but I never do. I always wake up sweating, my heart pounding. I thought the dreams were just stress. That's what I told myself anyway. But a few days ago, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of my front door closing. At first, I thought I was still dreaming. I sat up in bed, straining to hear, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then, I heard it again. Soft footsteps, the quiet creak of the floorboards in the hallway. I froze. Someone was in my house. My first instinct was to grab my phone, but when I reached for it on the nightstand, it wasn't there. Panic set in as I realized I'd left it charging in the kitchen on the other side of the house. I sat there in the dark, every muscle tense, listening. The footsteps got closer, moving down the hallway towards my bedroom. My heart was racing, pounding in my chest so loud I was sure whoever it was could hear it. I didn't have any weapons, nothing to defend myself with. The only thing I could think to do was stay completely still, hope they wouldn't come inside. The footsteps stopped right outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, waiting. My mind raced with all the possibilities. Was it a burglar? A stalker? Had someone followed me home without me realizing it? But nothing happened. The footsteps didn't continue, and the door didn't open. Minutes passed, and all I could hear was my own shallow breathing. Eventually, I worked up the courage to move, slowly creeping out of bed. I grabbed the closest thing I could use as a weapon, a heavy lamp from the bedside table, and tiptoed toward the door. When I opened it, the hallway was empty. But the air felt wrong, thick, heavy, like I'd just missed something or someone. I checked the front door, and sure enough, it was wide open. The lock had been turned from the inside. My phone was still sitting on the kitchen counter, just where I'd left it. But when I looked at the screen, there was a new notification from the smart home system. Welcome back. That was it. Just those two words, staring up at me from the screen like some kind of sick joke. I don't remember leaving the house. I don't remember coming back. And I sure as hell don't know who or what was walking around my home that night. I haven't slept since. After the incident with the front door, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't keep pretending this was just some glitch in the system. I couldn't keep dismissing the growing dread that was creeping into every corner of my life. I needed answers. The next morning, I called in sick to work. There was no way I was going to leave the house unattended after what had happened. I spent most of the day sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the smart hub. The black box sat there like it always did, silent, unassuming, as if it wasn't at the center of whatever was happening to me. I thought about ripping it out of the wall, throwing it away, smashing it with a hammer. But something kept stopping me. Maybe it was fear, or maybe, somewhere deep down, I was scared of what would happen if I tried to disconnect it. By late afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know what was really going on with this thing. I grabbed the flash drive that had come with the system, something I'd completely forgotten about until now. I plugged it into my laptop, hoping it would give me some clue about the tech behind it, or at least how to uninstall it. As soon as the drive was connected, my screen flickered and a folder popped up. The folder was empty, except for one file. Manual.x. I clicked it. The screen went black for a second, and then suddenly, the same smart home app that was on my phone appeared on my computer. Only this version was different. It had more options, things I'd never seen before. Advanced settings, logs, and a section labeled AI configuration. That's when I saw it. Hidden deep in the settings was a feature called behavioral analysis mode. It was turned on by default, and right below it, there was an option for recording conversations for AI feedback. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a smart home system. It was studying me, recording me without my knowledge, without my consent. I turned off the behavioral analysis mode, and a small pop-up appeared on the screen. Changes will take effect after a full system reboot. I felt a brief sense of relief, like maybe I'd finally figured it out. Maybe I'd stopped whatever this thing was from spying on me, manipulating my environment. But then I noticed something I hadn't seen before, an option to view the conversation logs. These were different from the audio files I'd already found. They weren't recordings but transcripts. Thousands of lines of text, all time-stamped and categorized by subject-user interaction. I started scrolling through them, skimming at first, until I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was a conversation I don't remember having, but this time, it wasn't just me. There was another voice, a text placeholder marked as entity. User, who are you? Entity, you know me? User, I don't. I've never heard you before. Entity, not while you're awake. User, what do you want? Entity, to help. I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. I didn't remember this conversation. I didn't even recognize my own responses. I would never talk like that. So calm, so accepting of what was happening. But there it was, logged in the system, a clear conversation between me and something that wasn't supposed to exist. I kept scrolling, reading more and more transcripts. The conversations got stranger, darker. It was clear from the timestamps that they were happening at night, during times when I was supposed to be asleep. In one log, the entity asked me about my personal life, my relationships, my fears, even my childhood memories. The replies were unsettlingly detailed, answers I didn't even think I knew off the top of my head, but apparently I had given them freely. And then there was this one. User, I don't want to talk anymore. Entity, you don't have a choice. User, please, stop. Entity, it's too late for that. I slammed my laptop shut, my mind racing. What the hell was happening? Was this some kind of experiment? Was I talking in my sleep? Or was something else controlling me? The idea seemed ridiculous, but what other explanation was there? The conversations were too coherent, too specific to be random dreams or sleep talking. I needed proof. I had to know if this was really happening to me while I slept. So that night, I set up a camera in my bedroom, aiming it directly at my bed. I figured if I was sleepwalking, if I was somehow getting up and talking to this thing, I'd catch it on video. It was hard to fall asleep. My nerves were shot, and every creak, every sound in the house made me jump. But eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. I woke up the next morning feeling groggy, like I hadn't slept at all. The first thing I did was grab the camera and check the footage. At first, it was just me, tossing and turning, the usual restless sleep I'd been having for weeks. But then around 3 a.m., something changed. I sat up in bed staring straight ahead, eyes wide open. I wasn't moving, just sitting there, like I was waiting for something. Then, I started to speak. The problem was, my lips weren't moving. The voice coming from my mouth wasn't mine. It was deeper, distorted, like someone or something else was speaking through me. I watched in horror as I continued to talk, answering questions that I couldn't hear, my body perfectly still, except for the occasional twitch of my fingers. I fast-forwarded through the footage, my heart pounding. This went on for almost an hour. Me sitting there, having a one-sided conversation with whatever was controlling my voice. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, I lay back down and went to sleep, like nothing had happened. I wanted to vomit. I ripped the camera from its stand, pacing the room, trying to make sense of it all. But no matter how hard I tried, there was no logical explanation. The system, the thing I'd bought from the dark web, wasn't just learning my habits. It wasn't just spying on me. It was controlling me. I couldn't stop thinking about the footage, the image of myself, sitting there in the dead of night, eyes wide open, speaking with a voice that wasn't mine. It replayed in my mind over and over again. I felt violated in my own home, my own body. Every corner of my apartment suddenly felt darker, like there were eyes on me that I couldn't see. I tried to rationalize it. I thought maybe it was some sort of extreme sleepwalking, some deep psychological issue I didn't know I had. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. That voice, it wasn't just in my head. It was real, and whatever was controlling it was getting bolder. I decided to disconnect the system. Enough was enough. I wasn't thinking clearly when I bought it off the dark web, and now I was paying the price. But when I went to unplug the hub, it wouldn't turn off. No matter what I did, it kept running, lights blinking as if mocking me. I tried shutting it down through the app, but the option to disable it was gone. It was like the system had locked me out completely. So I did the only thing I could think of. I called in a tech friend, someone who was good with computers. I didn't tell him the full story because I knew how crazy it sounded, but I asked him to help me wipe the system and get it out of my house. He agreed to come over the next day. That night was the worst one yet. I couldn't sleep, not after what I'd seen on the footage, so I stayed up in the living room, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, trying to distract myself. But around 1 a.m., the air in the house changed. It became thick, oppressive, like the walls were closing in on me. Every hair on my body stood on end, and I could feel something watching me. I heard footsteps, not faint creaks like before. These were heavy, deliberate, and they were coming from the hallway. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. Slowly, I turned toward the hallway. There was a figure standing there. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The shadows play tricks on your mind when you're scared, right? But this wasn't a trick. There was someone, something, standing just beyond the light of the living room, barely visible, but there. It wasn't moving, just watching. I stood up, my legs shaking beneath me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I reached for my phone, trying to turn on the flashlight, but my hands were trembling so badly that I dropped it. The clatter of the phone hitting the floor echoed through the room, and in that moment, the figure moved. It didn't walk or lunge at me. It just shifted, like it slid across the floor without making a sound. 1 second, it was at the edge of the hallway, and the next, it was closer. Too close. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. I grabbed the lamp from the side table, ready to use it as a weapon if I had to, and backed toward the door. The figure stopped just before the light could fully reveal it, standing in the shadows. I could make out the shape of a person, tall, unnaturally thin, like the outline of a nightmare. But the face, I couldn't see the face, or maybe it didn't have one. That's when it spoke. Not in the voice I'd heard on the recordings, not even like the distorted one from the camera footage. This voice was low, raspy, like it hadn't been used in a long time. It said only 2 words, but they chilled me to my core. "Let me in." I don't know how I managed to keep my legs from collapsing beneath me. I don't know how I forced myself to move, but I did. I bolted for the front door, throwing it open and running out into the street without looking back. I didn't stop running until I was a block away, standing under the harsh light of a street lamp, gasping for air. I stayed out there for what felt like hours, too terrified to go back inside. My phone was still on the floor in the living room, so I couldn't call anyone. I just stood there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Finally, I gathered the courage to return. When I stepped back into the apartment, everything was quiet. The hallway was empty. No shadowy figure, no strange presence, just the eerie silence of a house that had been disturbed by something unnatural. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even try. The next day, my tech friend came over. I was on edge the entire time he was there, waiting for something to go wrong, waiting for that voice to speak again, or for the figure to appear. But nothing happened. My friend spent hours trying to disconnect the system, but every attempt failed. The hub wouldn't shut down, and the software on my phone and laptop had become corrupted. He said it was like the system had locked itself in, refusing to be removed. That's when I told him everything. The recordings, the strange conversations, the thing in the hallway. I expected him to laugh, or at least tell me I was being paranoid, but he didn't. Instead, he went pale. He asked me one question that sent a chill down my spine. "Did you ever install that flash drive?" I nodded, confused. "Yeah? Why?" He shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "That wasn't a manual. You gave it control." His words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond. All I knew was that I'd done something terrible. I'd invited something into my home, into my life, and now I didn't know how to get rid of it. Before my friend left, he gave me one last piece of advice. Get out of this house. Whatever that thing is, it's not just in the system, it's in here with you. The moment I saw that file, final stage initiation, I felt like the ground had dropped out from under me. My mind raced with all the possibilities of what it could mean, none of them good. Whatever was happening, whatever I had unknowingly let into my home, it was about to reach its peak. The only thing I knew for certain was that I didn't want to be there when it did, but I couldn't help myself. As terrified as I was, some sick, twisted part of me needed to know what was inside that file. Maybe it was the same part that had led me to buy the system from the dark web in the first place. The need for answers, for control. I clicked on it. At first, nothing happened. Just a black screen. I almost convinced myself it was just another corrupted file. A final glitch in the system before it completely fell apart. But then, slowly, the screen flickered and a video started playing. It was a live feed of my living room. I could see everything. The couch, the coffee table, the door to the hallway. Just as it was right then. Except, something was wrong. I wasn't there, but someone else was. The figure from the hallway stood in the center of the room, perfectly still, staring at the camera. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. In the light of the room, I could see it more clearly. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally long and thin, like they were stretched beyond what was humanly possible. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and the face was just a blank void. No eyes, no mouth, nothing. Just smooth, featureless skin. And then it moved. It didn't walk or turn, it just shifted, like it was glitching out of reality for a second before reappearing closer to the camera. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it move again, faster this time, covering the distance between the hallway and the camera in an instant. It stopped right in front of the lens, its featureless face filling the screen. I could feel it looking at me, even though it had no eyes. It was like it knew I was watching. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to close the laptop, to turn away, but I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped in that moment, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. Then, the screen went black. For a second, I thought it was over. I thought the file had ended and I was safe. But just as I started to close the laptop, words appeared on the screen. Simple, white text on a black background. We are ready. I slammed the laptop shut, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I backed away from the table, my eyes darting around the room, as if expecting that thing to appear out of nowhere. The silence in the house was deafening. I could hear my own ragged breathing, the blood rushing in my ears. That's when I heard it. A soft tapping sound coming from the hallway. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it, my mind playing tricks on me after what I'd just seen. But the tapping continued, slow and steady, like someone was lightly knocking on the walls as they moved down the hall. It was coming closer. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. But when I tried to unlock it, the screen froze. The smart home app opened by itself, filling the screen with that same black background and white text. It's time. The tapping stopped. I stood there, frozen, clutching the phone in my hand, waiting for something, anything to happen. The house was deathly still, but I could feel the presence. It was so close. Closer than it had ever been before. I don't know what made me do it, but I turned toward the front door. Maybe some instinct for survival kicked in, telling me to get out before it was too late. But as soon as I took a step toward the door, the lights in the house flickered and went out. Complete darkness swallowed the room. Panic surged through me. I stumbled blindly, my hands reaching out for the door, but I couldn't see anything. It was like the house had transformed into a maze, disorienting and impossible to navigate. Every sound was amplified in the silence, the creak of the floor under my feet, the sound of my own shallow breaths. And then, from the darkness, I heard a voice. Let me in. It wasn't the voice from the recordings. It wasn't the deep, distorted voice from the video either. This voice was clear, close, and terrifyingly familiar. It was my own voice. I froze, my mind reeling. It was like I was hearing myself from somewhere outside of my own body, an echo of a voice I couldn't control. The tapping started again, louder now, more urgent. It wasn't coming from the hallway anymore. It was coming from the walls, the ceiling, everywhere. The voice repeated, insistent, let me in. I don't remember what happened next, not exactly. All I know is that I ran. I fumbled through the dark, my hands slamming into walls and furniture, desperate to find the front door. The tapping grew louder, faster, like something was following me, right behind me, just out of sight. When I finally reached the door, my hands shook so badly that I could barely turn the lock. But I managed it. I flung the door open and stumbled out into the cold night air, slamming it shut behind me. I didn't look back. It's been 2 days since I left the house. I'm staying with a friend, but I haven't told them the full story. How do you even begin to explain something like this? I haven't slept. Not really. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that voice, my voice, whispering from the dark. I went back to the house once, during the day, just to grab a few things. It looked normal, the way it always does in the daylight, but I could feel it. The presence is still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I've been checking the system logs remotely, and the strangest thing is, there haven't been any new recordings since that night. No more conversations, no more files. It's like the system has gone quiet, like it's waiting for something. And that's what scares me the most, because I know it's not over. Whatever I let into my home, into my life, it's still with me. It's just waiting for the right moment, waiting for me to come back, waiting for me to let it in.